I want to bring into the chat Zephyr Teachout. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Is my sound okay? Is it coming through?
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
Okay.
Yeah, I know you've limited time because you do a lot of things in the world. What are your thoughts on what happened and also what has to happen in terms of impeachment and in terms of big tech and mostly those two things? Yeah.
Well, I want to. I think impeachment is absolutely essential, but I really want to focus our time on big tech because although there's been a little attention on this, and maybe you talked about this earlier in the program,
not so much.
Okay. Yeah. But it is absolutely urgent that we take this moment, and it's been urgent for some time, but I think what's happened this past week should make it clear to a lot of people to transform the business model of the big social media companies, Facebook, YouTube, in particular. And you may remember seeing headlines about this a few years ago, the horrific genocide in Myanmar. And Facebook's role and the way in which officials used Facebook's algorithm, which does not passively allow posts or let you see posts in the order in which they are shared, but chooses what will be served up to you, in which officials in Myanmar used Facebook's algorithms, which prioritize high conflict content, conspiracy theories in this country, white nationalism, ethnic violence, to incite and build support for horrific genocide there. And I think that felt very far away to a lot of people here. It obviously was not very far away for the people there. But what we know is that we are allowing the center of our communications infrastructure to be governed by a business model which is designed to destroy democracy and the ability to come together and govern ourselves. And I think a lot of people look at this as a kind of fact of nature. They think, well, that is what tech is. It's a sort of an organic understanding as opposed to a mechanical understanding. This is absolutely a policy choice. We have this amazing business model that we use for telephones, for instance, which is that you pay for the service of being able to use telephones. And you can have Congress using a long history of the public utility regulation is one way to talk about it, or common carriage, to say, hey, if you are essential communications infrastructure, you can't have this business model because this business model is destroying us. And we'll get into conversation, but just one point that relates to this is that we know from Facebook itself, and Google uses the same business model, that 2/3 of people who joined extremist groups did so after Facebook recommended they do so. And so maybe if you're watching here, you say, well, extremist groups haven't been recommended to me, but you've got to believe the data. This is basically the business model says, let's go find the things that make the heart rate go up. They're the most conflict prone. And if that's true, and we know it's true, what that means is that what happened this week in DC, what is happening with the deep disbelief, along with the white nationalism, the deep illegitimacy, the sort of push for illegitimacy around peaceful transfer of power, all of that, it's not like Facebook allowed some of it to passively happen. It was promoting that on its platform. And so I really think one of the key things that we have to be pushing for here is for Biden's administration to take the considerable power, and the executive branch has actually really outsized power when it comes to antitrust policy, and push within Congress to transform how we allow big tech to trot all over us and to be part of destroying democracy.
So I think this is a really good point, Zephyr, and I'm really glad you're here because I've seen so many people sort of using this to make the sort of free speech argument that, I've even seen leftists sort of making this argument, sort of following Trump being banned across all these platforms, this kind of a free speech argument. And, I guess what I would say about that is that has been like a false argument from the very beginning. This was an argument made by these tech companies to allow them to like monetize. And, this is really what it is about, is like making money from extreme types of content. And so I think it's really good. And I think, it is really good to refocus this conversation on what the actual issue is here, which is all these companies creating a monopoly on communication as a profit engine. You know what I mean? Like Trump being banned off of these websites is not a problem to me. That to me is just like these websites starting to, reckon with the reality of this, which is, that like they have profited off of like this form of speech for a very long time. And I agree with you that we need to focus our energy on taking down these companies rather than, arguing for the president's rights to be on them or something.
Well, I think, again, we tend to naturalize it and treat it like this isn't something we can have the kind of communications infrastructure we want. Designing and supporting a decentralized communications infrastructure has been central to allowing for the possibility of a democracy. And so there's sort of two different models that people use. One is the platform, and the other is to say they're just like any other journalistic publication, but they're trying to have the best of both worlds. And they don't really mind if we see them as the leaders and we're spending all our time begging them. So I have very little patience with Zuckerberg, very little patience with YouTube, but I don't think our energy should be focused on begging them to act, but really understand that it is Congress's job to make sure that they do not have the power that they do. Because whatever Zuckerberg does, he's not going to give up this quasi-king-like power that he has right now on his own. That is Congress's job. And the political will is there. And this is one of these areas where there's sort of very weird, or maybe not weird, very powerful cross-partisan alliances. So you see a lot of Republicans who are not Republicans in office who are not supporting this. Make them vote on it. This is like definitely something to push the vote. And I guess just one other point. I mean, my focus this week has to be on just like understanding that when you're thinking who is responsible here. Imagine if you had 10 years. Imagine from 2010, beginning of the Tea Party, 2009, beginning of the Tea Party to now, if the core social media companies, YouTube and Facebook, had a different business model. My belief is that we would not have seen what we saw this week at the Capitol. We would not see the numbers of people who don't believe in the election. You have a totally different incentive instead of Facebook and YouTube having the incentive to push conspiracy theories to the top. So like thinking about what that has meant and going to the deep, deep disease at the heart of our communications infrastructure is so essential, because no number of Band-Aids are going to solve it. But I got to also say, it's also important as a form of stimulus. Because the other thing that Facebook and Google do is they just suck money out of the economy. Journalists know this, obviously, but content producers, small businesses who cannot be heard without advertising on Facebook and Google. What we know from the recent lawsuits, but it's a no-brainer, is Facebook and Google are jacking up their prices. So if your community restaurants that are dying right now without federal support are also having to shovel over money to these monopolies that are standing in this choke point role. So it's essential democratic policy and it's good economic policy at the same time.
It seems like there's a parallel between the way that people talk about like capitalism as this free market thing where there's no intervention. And that's just the way it is. It's the rule of nature, as you were saying. They naturalize it, right? And the stuff with Facebook and other tech companies where it's like it's not that they're just not intervening, like you said, right? They are intervening, but there's this like funny, like, you know, Adam Smith delusion in both capitalism and in tech stuff. So could you just talk about like what this would look like if they how you know, politicians could stop them from intervening and what it would look like?
Yeah. So let's just take Facebook. You, first of all, it's really important to break it up from Instagram and WhatsApp. I mean, this is such an openly lawless company. When you have basically every state AG going after them, you know, one, that it's politically popular, and two, they're breaking a lot of laws, and they're doing it pretty openly. But that kind of breakup is important. So at moments where there's where Facebook is promoting certain things, you can say, hey, I don't like this toxicity on this site. I'm going to move somewhere else. And that's not a real option right now if you want to be heard. But the second thing is treat it like a public utility. And I wrote with Sabeel Rahman a piece last year about how we could use public utility regulation. And what that would mean is public utility regulation regulates the business model. So you basically say you can't use targeted ads. That's one. Right. So instead, you would be charged, you know, between $1 and $15 a month to use a social media service like you use your phone service. But instead of having the heart of our communications infrastructure be preferring toxicity, preferring white nationalism, it would have to be neutral, and would also then have to take all comers in a neutral way. So think of it a little bit like a railroad for communications. And one of the things that would do is open up more opportunities for local journalism, because I mean, this is a complex machine, and I do want to stay away from organic metaphors, because that tends to make us just throw up our hands and say, well, unless we fix, the profit motive, there's nothing we can do. But the truth is that there's actually a lot within the existing system that we can do. So basically, common carriage or public utility. It has to treat all comers equally and can't use the targeted ad business model. And then also can't own different producers who rely on the site. So there's a conflict of interest. Those are the key elements here. And the amazing thing is that in the report that just came out of the House Antitrust Subcommittee, they're advocating for this kind of model for social media. So it's one of those areas where it really is just going to take Biden and leadership to push it forward. It's possible. It feels like it's too late, but the truth is it's really dangerous. We have to act now. And as Jack was saying, treating it in terms of episodic, like who is banned and who isn't banned, is missing the whole point. It's like the disease is the business model. The disease is the business model. Mm-hmm. And Congress's job is communications like having a decentralized communications infrastructure. Like nothing, clearly that's Congress's job. That's what the first Congress is doing, and that's what the Congress is doing in the 1970s, and that's what Congress should be doing now.
Yeah. And you think that there's any hope? I mean, you seem to be somewhat hopeful while saying it looks like it's too late, but you're saying it's not too late. What can people do? Because, something you say in your book, Break 'em Up, which is a great book, is like, don't feel bad about not boycotting Amazon.
No.
Because that's just not an effective way to go about it. Does that apply? And that applies to other, like to Facebook. So
right. YouTube is a huge problem.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say, hey, get off YouTube and don't have any audience members.
Right.
You need the audience members. It's like saying get off the roads, but don't complain about the potholes in the roads.
Right.
So it's just that our habit has become so deeply, like, you may think, oh, you're not neoliberal, but the sort of boycott instinct, like first, you're a consumer first, is like, oh, if I have a problem with Facebook or YouTube, my first job is my intimate, personal, it's like my relationship with God first is through my relationship with YouTube. As opposed to say, call Chuck Schumer. He's the new majority leader.
Right.
He's holding the cards here.
I also think sometimes, the consumer choice thing makes it so that people are like, all right, I've done something. I've done my part. And it's like, it's actually better to keep ordering from Amazon, but force Chuck Schumer to act on them. I was going to ask, Zephyr, what do you think about like Section 230 in this world where we had publicly, public utility online social media, and in the short term, what do you think about Section 230 and repealing it or versus reforming it?
Can you explain to listeners what that is?
So,
in my 1 minute left, it's and I'd be happy to come back on and talk more about it. But there's a basic idea in law which I find very compelling and I think applies here, which is that something that is promoted, not merely allowed,
right,
you have responsibility and you are liable for. So like if an innkeeper actively, all these sort of law school analogies are also like weird and
right.
1930s, something in, but I'm going to use it.
If a bar wench,
yeah.
If you have an innkeeper who actively like sprays the sidewalk with water on an icy day, and then somebody comes along and slips,
right.
That's really different than an innkeeper who's like, well, I don't know, I don't care about the sidewalk. Once you're inside, you're inside. And so the choice to actively do something creates liability. And so I would apply the same principle here, which is that for promoted posts, liability should exist. And so the effect there then would be to discourage the promotion, basically require more awareness around the promotion of posts. I really think the more key thing is starting with the business model. I feel like we're doing sort of patches,
right.
But a lot of times when people are talking about 230, they're lying, just to be clear, especially on the right.
Right. Yes.
It's that's why it's a weird area to sort of enter briefly.
Well, it's also such a weird thing, for the right to even talk about it, because I'm like, Section 230 would mean that these companies have to moderate what you are saying. They would have to moderate your political ads, but whatever.
Right. Yeah. And I guess the deeper point here, well, a sort of a historical way to think about it is that when journalism started being penny press journalism, working class journalism, which is absolutely essential, journalism that is paid for not by wealthy investors who are waiting to see whether their ship's cargo was not damaged or not, but journalism, working class journalism, popular and local journalism in the mid to late 19th century. A lot of the first stuff was filled with lies, just lies. Like there's People on the Moon with Wings was one of the most popular early publications that went through several different iterations. And the way that law developed is say, well, if you are going to hold yourself out as a journalist, you're going to be responsible, right? So that otherwise we're just going to have lots of false stories out there. And this just goes back to the beginning of the conversation, which is that the platforms are trying to have it both ways. They're trying to claim as a protection, we're just like journalists, but they don't have the obligations that journalists do. And that I actually don't want them to be journalists. I think it's better for them to be platforms, but to be neutral in public utilities and then actually support more journalism. I don't want, Facebook journalism.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And any other final message you want to tell people?
Well, it's a strange moment because we're beginning the Biden administration. And the one thing I will say that gives me, not the one thing, but one thing that gives me some hope is that in the last 3 weeks, we have seen Biden move on two big things in a big way, on the $2,000 checks and on impeachment. And I've always thought Biden's a bit of a question mark, but the fact that he's moved so quickly twice, even before being president, means that those of us who are activists and pushing know we have our marching orders. This is an administration that may not say it likes to listen, but is sensitive to grassroots activity, which is why it's really, really important to be pushing a very aggressive economic agenda and accountability.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Zephyr. Definitely come back on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.